Welcome everyone. How's it going? We're going to be looking at the New Deal, this chapter 26 today, and let's go from here. We sort of touched base on this in the previous days of how this all started up, so we're going to get directly to that point. Obviously, we had a Great Depression with lots of stuff going on, unemployment, loss of jobs, stocks, banks, it crashing, the farming community crashing as well. We're also going to have the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt, who basically is going to promise a brand new deal for American society. We looked at his inaugural address, and his inaugural address, he calls out the banks, he calls out industry, he calls out the past administrations for not doing enough. And what he says, he's going to be very honest, very candid, and going to get right to the point. The nation asks for action. The action is now. And a great cartoon is this, again, just basically pushing the action to the American people at all cost. Okay, so right away, we're going to call this the first 100 days because FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, I'm going to use his acronym FDR, is going to immediately start making changes the second he gets into the White House. And he is going to now basically do something that pretty much no president has ever done before. Directly make so many sweeping changes within just literally minutes of his taking the presidency after his inauguration. And future presidents will also compare how their first 3 months go based off these first 100 days. He's also need to restore confidence, the confidence of the American people, both in the presidency and also the economy. And that's a big part of this. He's going to need to restore that. A big part of that restoration of the faith in government is going to be had in these fireside chats. These are really important because what's going to happen is he's going to take to the airwaves, the radio, the medium of the radio, and talk directly to the American people. Talk to them in a way that allows them to understand basically what he's doing and how he's doing it. And he's going to use that medium to get into their living rooms and talk to them directly, very informally, very just like person to person, without the whole the protocol and the bigness of a press conference. These aren't press conferences. These are weekly radio addresses where he's from the White House talking again directly trying to speak to the American people. The first fireside chat was going to lay out how he was going to take care of the major problem that he saw as a cause, the banking and the banking institution and the loss of faith in the banking system. So the first thing he does, again, literally within days of his inauguration, he closes the banks. He gets Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Act. We call this the bank holiday. We call it that because basically these banks are going to close down and the government's going to check these banks. And in 4 days, he's going to reopen the banks. The good ones who are solvent, who have a strong financial backing, that were not involved in the crash and didn't have bad investments, he's going to open those up. The ones that had really poor finances, that had got involved in risky stocks that crashed down, he's going to keep those closed. The whole point of this is to get the government or get the public trusted in the bank system again. That was the whole point. Get the people in trusting in the bank system again. And they started to do that. Once the banks opened, people started to stop making runs on banks. They had to do something else to get people to actually put their savings into the banks. We'll get to that in a little bit, but at least people stopped making runs on banks because of this. He also going to repeal prohibition right away. He thought that prohibition was a dying thing, that basically it was a lost cause, people were going to drink anyway, and we were putting so much money into enforcement. So the thought was, is if we can get rid of prohibition, it could actually not be a money loss, but a money gain through the increased tax revenue. So that ends, and that does allow the government to then take in more taxes that they could use for servicing the economy and helping putting people back to work. Okay, one of the big sectors of the economy that we talked about as needing to be fixed was the agricultural economy. crop prices had and plummeted, not plummeted, plummeted during the 1920s after World War One. How do we get these crop prices back up was going to be both the key part of this agency and also a major sort of a constitutional dilemma as well. We'll get to that in a second. Okay. Just a month and a half after his inauguration, he passes the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what that did was very controversial. He encouraged farmers to reduce production of both their crops and livestock. So literally plowing under half of your fields or killing half of your stock of pigs or cows or sheep or chickens or whatever livestock that you harvest and grew. This was so very controversial because, one, it would actually reduce surplus, and that was the whole point, to get surplus lower to artificially raise prices of these goods. But of course, to do that, to encourage that, the government actually paid these farmers to do that. It wasn't like, oh, please kill half your crops or kill half your livestock. Is we'll pay you to kill your livestock or plow under your crops. And because of that, surplus is going to go down, and that's true. By surplus going down, prices are going to artificially raise. That is the controversial part of that for two reasons. One legally and one morally. Let's get on the moral one first. So obviously, this is going to help farmers big time, right? Because what's going to happen to crop prices and food prices? Take a guess. They're going to go up, right? That's going to help farmers. But how's that going to affect people in the city that have lost their jobs? Those factory workers that have now lost wages. They're now going to have to pay more for food that they already can't afford. So that is the moral dilemma here. Nothing legal, nothing constitutional wrong with that, but again, a moral dilemma here. Okay, now we get to the constitutional part. Can the government do this? Is this part of the Constitution? Can they actually use the government funds to pay for farmers to do this? And here's the thing. There was actually a couple court cases that will claim this as unconstitutional. We'll get to that later, but I'm going to throw up the court case in right now. Let me find that on the slide. And then we'll go back to that a little later on. Give me 1 second. There we go. I thought I had it. I'm going to have to talk to you guys that later on. There's a court case that declares this unconstitutional. But I don't have that with me right now. Okay, so this is declared unconstitutional by a Supreme Court case. And that Supreme Court case is going to state that this Agricultural Adjustment Act goes above and beyond the duty of Congress and the President. And it's going to be declared unconstitutional, meaning that it won't be able to operate, and so farmers aren't going to have this benefit anymore. A couple things he also does for farmers. He does pass the Farm Security Administration, which provides loans to farmers. And this is a big one right here. This is the one I do want you to know. The Rural Electrification Administration. That puts huge amounts of government money to basically provide and build more power facilities and more power lines out to rural areas. That's important because now these rural areas are going to have electrification, which means they're going to want brand new products. They're going to want refrigerators and radios and vacuum cleaners and washing machines and electric irons and toaster ovens and stuff like that, which is going to make a surge in new product purchases. These people that maybe have not had these things forever, have heard about them, have read about them, have seen them in print media, are now going to want a refrigerator. So it's going to cause a boom in new sales. Again, a small one, but still a boom in new sales, which is going to help the economy to a small degree. And here you go, you see here farm industry, it's all depressed, and then there's farm poverty, low prices, and see FDR, and he's going to have the farm relief plan, the New Deal, and he's going to put a new coat of paint on the farmers. Okay, now getting the industry back in order. So these are the part of the recovery plans we're talking about. We're trying to get the farming to recover, trying to get industry to recover. He created the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, which creates the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. And this is going to be controversial as well, because what it does, it's going to put the government in charge of regulating wages, prices of goods, and working conditions. It will also create this PWA, which we'll get to in another slide. This is controversial because typically only the states get to control wages, prices of goods, and working conditions within their state. So now we have a federal agency that's controlling all of the states and all of the industries, regardless if it's interstate or intrastate. So we will see this declared unconstitutional as well with the case of the Schechter Poultry Company versus the U.S. The Schechter Poultry Company is a small poultry company in New York, and they're saying that the government should not control their wages or their working conditions because they are within the state of New York. And then therefore, they should not be controlled by the federal government, that only the state of New York has that right to do that. And the Supreme Court is going to rule in their favor, thus declaring this act and this administration unconstitutional. So right there's two big Supreme Court cases that go against the New Deal. So if you think about this in a bigger sense, what branch of the government is starting to push back on FDR and his New Deal policies? It's a judicial branch. That's really important because we're going to get to that later on about what FDR does to try to maybe push back against the Supreme Court. One thing that this does do is does create a relief agency, this PWA. And the PWA is the Public Works Administration, which is a full relief agency that is aimed at one thing and one thing only, putting people back to work. Since industry had fired workers, this agency was going to put these workers into government positions to build things like parks and roads and dams and airports and train stations and all other infrastructure items to help rebuild America. And it's going to be very successful in putting people to work and getting people wages. And the thought is eventually these people will have money, and eventually they will put the money back into the economy, and the economy is going to get better, and then slowly industry is going to hire these people back into industrial jobs. That was the whole sort of key of this. Another program that was going to be created was going to do a couple things. It was going to put people to work. It was going to provide recovery for the area of the South, and it's going to be reform because we're still going to have these things today. Okay, so the Tennessee Valley Authority was going to be this huge project to basically dam up the Tennessee rivers and the tributaries of the Tennessee River. And there's going to be like 25 dams all up along the river. Okay, the relief part is literally you're going to have to hire people to build the dams, give people work directly for years and years and years. Because these dams are going to take years to build all these different dams. Secondly, the recovery part. Immediately, it's going to generate cheap electricity that's going to be given to these rural areas of Tennessee and Georgia and North Carolina and Kentucky. So these areas are going to be flooded with cheap electricity, which is going to also electrify the area. And then it's going to be reformed because these dams are being placed even today, still producing electricity, still stopping flooding, providing irrigation water, and entertainment as well. Because what's behind the dam is a lake, is a reservoir that could be used for boating and skiing and swimming and kayaking and canoeing, and you can have lake houses and resorts on these lakes. And so it's going to be a beneficial thing for these southern economies, these rural economies as well. Okay, now let's get into the big thing, getting the banks, the stock market, and the currency back into line. That was going to be his big goal. I got to this last, but I really should have came probably first because this was the most important thing. But I wanted to take a little more time on this as well. So first, he's going to end the gold standard. That doesn't really have much impact on the Depression, but it will be really important because it allows the government to either inflate or deflate currency as the dollar is needed. So now the government could lower or raise the value of the dollar based on economic conditions by either putting more currency into circulation or pulling out currency from circulation. So that is going to be a big thing. It's not going to be a big part of the depression, though. Okay, let's have another drink. Okay, the Glass-Steagall Act is going to be passed in June of '33. And what this is for is to really create confidence in the banks. So the bank holiday did that, and people stopped pulling their money out. But to get people to put their money back into the banks, people wanted guarantees. People wanted protection. So this Glass-Steagall Act will basically give the government direct ability to regulate banks and also making sure that banks do not speculate onto the stock market. So it allows them a lot of regulation there. It will also create the FDIC. Again, one of these alphabet soup agencies. We call these alphabet soup agencies because you have all these acronyms. You throw all these acronyms into a bowl, it looks like a bowl of alphabet soup. So basically, make sure you write that down because that does come up on AP Desk, like the phrase of alphabet soup. Okay, the FDIC is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And at the time, it basically insured people's deposit in banks. So if you put your money into a bank, it would make sure that if that bank failed, the government would pay you back. And now it's much, much, much more than $2,500. But at the time, it said, even if the bank fails, your money is safe. So this allowed people to trust the banks again and start putting their money back into the banks, trusted. You have the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, which will be a direct regulatory body that controls and regulates the stock market. And it still is there today. So it's not only is this a recovery administration, it's also a reform administration because it's still around today protecting the stock market from having major collapses that may be avoided. We still will have collapses and really bad days because that's the nature of the stocks, the nature of the economy. But what this is supposed to do is make sure that these companies don't cook the books, or they don't artificially inflate their values, or they don't do things that are illegal on the stock market, merging companies together or illegally trading or buying stocks. Things like that, this regulatory body is going to enforce and check to make sure we don't have like artificial problems with the stock market. Okay, we are also going to see a major push in federal relief. So we already have the PWA. We're also going to create other relief agencies to directly help the public. One of them is going to be the FERA, F-E-R-A, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and that's going to provide huge amounts of money to give to states. And the purpose of this is for the state to then divvy up the money to local food banks and counties and other agencies within the state to then give direct relief to people. And again, this is not jobs. This is money for food and money for clothing and blankets and stuff like that. So it's basically the federal government giving money to states, and then the states then divide that up among the counties and where it's needed. And again, it gives direct food to the public. Okay, you're going to have the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, which is going to, again, put people directly to work to build roads, schools, parks, and even do things like sweeping streets, like literally paying you just to sweep sidewalks. So some of these projects were of little use, like sweeping sidewalks. This was literally just to put people to work. And again, gets people's jobs. Okay, a very popular one of his agencies is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And that's going to put millions of young people, young men particularly, into jobs to work in the national parks and forests to build trails and roads and visitor centers and bathrooms and campgrounds and all sorts of different things to enhance our national park, national forest system. So extremely popular and still around today. A lot of the things they built are are built during the 1930s. So if you go to a national park, there's a good chance that that visitor center was built in the 30s. That lodge, that hotel area in the park was built in the 30s. That kiosk at the entrance station, that sign that says "Welcome to Grand Canyon" was probably built in the 1930s. That trail you walk on was probably built in the 30s. Huge, huge endeavor. And the reason why they wanted young men is that these young men obviously didn't have families yet. So their money was going to be sent directly to their families back east, typically. A lot of this was in the west, where a lot of this was going to be going on, because that's where the national parks, national forests were. But their money was going to be sent back to their families, and they were going to be given just a little stipend, because all their rent, all their food was going to be provided for them in these little. Because again, they're in the middle of nowhere, so it's not like they need their money to go out and buy clothes and to buy food, because they're a lot of times hundreds of miles away from any really big city to buy things in. So very successful. These are some of the lodges, some of the bridges that were built. Okay. Also, we're going to see FDR create an agency, the Farm Credit Administration, the FCA, and the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to make sure that these small farmers and these homeowners stay in their houses and don't get foreclosed upon by the banks. Here is the caveat, though. Here's the one exception. That these people have to have some type of income to begin with. They have to have a job and show that they can pay their mortgage, pay their rent a little bit. So that was a big part of that. They have to be able to have a job, have something so they can at least repay their loan and their debt a little bit. These are you see the cartoon. Let's move this up a little bit. Okay, so you see the FDR with the mortgage relief, and you see there's huge mortgage on top of both their heads, and they're wanting FDR to shoot off the mortgage to relieve some of their stress. Very popular. Okay, so just because he's helping the economy out, he is going to have some critics going against him. So here's some critics of FDR and the New Deal. So one group is going to be very, very much thinking that Roosevelt is doing way too much, that he's going above and beyond his constitutional duties and almost becoming like a communist, where the government is controlling way too much of the economy. They think that he's getting into too much socialism here. This was called the American Liberties League. And I love this cartoon. It says, "Mommy, Tommy wrote a dirty word." Dirty word, Roosevelt, right? They called him a dictator. They think, again, he's doing way, way, way too much. That all these different agencies are really bad for America, that he can easily create them, but can he truly raise them, and will they be good for America? And I love this cartoon we'll get to. We see FDR climbing into the dictatorship. First step he's already done. He's reorganized the government. He reorganized basically all these different agencies that now government is controlling: agriculture and industry and banking and the stock market, and is dealing with home loans and all this stuff. We'll get into the second step a little later on in the lecture. We also have a person, Francis Townsend, that thinks he needs to do more, that he needs to actively do more to help the economy out. And what he's doing, he's basically saying we need to do more for old people. We need to do more for people that are unemployed. He says we need this Townsend plan, where basically all Americans over the age of 60 would receive a pension or government help. We'll get to how this helps in a little bit. But eventually, Roosevelt will say, "You're right, Francis Townsend, we do need that." And we're going to create the Social Security Act in that second New Deal a little later on. And here's a great cartoon, basically old age insurance, a little bit that is given to old people every single month. You have Father Charles Coughlin, who actually attacks some of Roosevelt's plan on the banking system and the currency system, and he thought that basically Roosevelt should do even more to rework those systems. And then you probably have the most outspoken and extreme of the critics, Huey Long, and he thought that Roosevelt should go way more so to the left. He thought that basically we should completely tax every single rich person, put a huge rich tax on everything, and basically take the rich's money to give to the poor. and then not through direct money, but basically through services. And this was called Share Our Wealth program. He thought that we should become an extreme socialist country. He eventually will be assassinated before he makes a run for the presidency. Okay, after 2 years of the New Deal, Roosevelt is going to fully go into a second New Deal. And now we're going to talk about labor and the government a little bit. So one thing he does in the second New Deal, he does create the National Labor Relations Board, which is the Wagner Act. And what that does, it legalizes collective bargaining. It makes unions legitimate. So Roosevelt, like his cousin, is going to be a champion of organized labor and actually going to step in and get involved within strikes and organized labors during the Great Depression. The most famous of these strikes is called the sit-down strike, where basically GM auto workers are going to go on strike into 17 other GM plants. And what Roosevelt does is actually do nothing, and that's the important thing. He doesn't do anything to interfere with this strike. Eventually, because GM is basically shut down, they literally sit down in the factory. That's why it's called sit-down strike. So GM is basically closed down for weeks and weeks and weeks. The company will eventually give in to demands. And the importance of this is that the government is going to stop getting involved in these labor disputes on the side of the ownership. And that's going to be a big thing because during the 1920s and right after the World War I, we see the government sort of put down unions again after a whole couple of decades of the progressive era where they were promoting unionization. Here's a couple of pictures of the sit-down strikes. Okay. He will also create, and this is really important, the Fair Labor and Standards Act. And what that does, it creates a national minimum wage, it creates a national 40-hour work week, and finally, it creates federal limitations on child labor. So finally, we have a national labor law that goes across all the states and makes workers' rights extremely important. We still have this today. We still are mandated by a 40-hour work week. We still have a national minimum wage, and we still have limits on child labor that are still around today. Extremely important on its large sweeping effects that still affect us today. Also part of the second New Deal is Social Security. He's going to provide retirement, insurance disability, and payments for unemployment. So if you lose a job, you're going to get a check every 2 weeks from the government. If and the real point of this is this part. It provides retirement insurance. And the reason why this is so important is that it is wanting people that are age 65 or older to quit their jobs. They want them to quit their jobs and stop working so a younger person can take that job. So therefore, even though it's not providing jobs, it's sort of providing new jobs because it's going to encourage older people to leave and retire, thus giving younger people a new job that they can go into. And that's going to be really, really important. And basically a monthly check to you, again, a Social Security check there. It's also going to provide the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. It's going to provide work for over 2 million Americans. Again, a relief agency to build airports, schools, roads, and other things like that. It's also going to have a non-traditional work assistance program for artists as well. This is going to be the Federal Arts Project. It's going to be the Federal Music Project, Federal Writers Project, Federal Theater Project, and it's going to basically provide money to artists and musicians and playwrights and actors to do free concerts in the park and paint murals on government buildings and do other things to put these people to work as well and create a larger cultural connection to America. And so you see the Federal Music Project, part of the WPA, Federal Arts Project. So make sure you know that WPA was more than just a normal works project. Here's some of the murals that were created during this time period. in 1936, he's going to run for re-election, and this is where we're going to see an electoral realignment. We're going to start seeing people that had never voted for the Democratic Party to start to vote for the Democratic Party. In some cases, it's going to be African Americans, but very few African Americans are going to start to do that. But we're also going to see other parts of the country starting to vote for the Democratic ticket over the Republican ticket. And so we see here in 1936, he wins in a landslide, even more so than his 1932 vote. So obviously, Roosevelt, what he's doing is helping the economy and helping America out. You see he just sweeps 61% of the popular vote, and then huge amount of electoral vote. One of the biggest landslide victories of all time. And then you're going to see this electoral realignment. Roosevelt's going to gain popularity among non-traditional Democratic voters, Western farmers, the poor, unemployed Northerners, and again, in some cases, black voters. Again, I remember in the South, the black voters were sort of disenfranchised, but in the North, the black voters are going to be able to vote in many cases. So these non-traditional Democrats are going to start voting Democrat. And we're going to see a trend here, that in the upcoming elections, we're going to see that the Democrats are going to start winning some non-Democrat areas. Again, this is more normal. But we're going to start to see this shift, really with Kennedy, where you see this shift basically from where you see Democrats in a lot of these other states. In the next election, we're going to see it flip-flop, where now Republicans have become the Southern party, and the Democrats have become the more Northern and Western party. You see here, they're big. It's going to be in the South. Again, Nixon really sweeps this one big time, and Reagan. And by this time, we see a complete flip-flop of the Republican and the Democratic Party here. And by the current terms, the Republicans pretty much now own this southern area, and the Democrats own this northern and western area. So complete sort of flip-flop of electoral realignment. Okay, the New Deal in disarray. A lot of things regarding the New Deal going on. So one thing is that the New Deal, basically FDR was being attacked by the Supreme Court. So he had a plan. He wanted to threaten the Supreme Court to get them to stop taking away his agencies. You see here in this cartoon, there's FDR, and they had already taken away through court cases the AAA and the NRA. And they're saying, we may be back later for those other pieces, the TVA. And so what he did, the Supreme Court also had cases against the SSA, the NLRB, and TVA as well. So FDR threatened to overhaul the judicial branch by adding 6 new Supreme Court judges. And the reason why is he thought that the Supreme Court thought that FDR had taken too much power, and the thought was that we can change that by adding new judges that were going to be like-minded Roosevelt. So here's a couple of great cartoons that the judges that he would add are, of course, going to be Roosevelt-appointed judges that are going to be all like-minded. And here's a great cartoon that goes against this. Basically, he's trying to put pressure and push down the Supreme Court and put his foot on them to control them. And you see here FDR there, and you see the new judges, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all yes men. And what's in the trash can? Again, the whole balance of power, the Constitution, the checks and balances. So this is another negative cartoon. So we see a negative cartoon here, another negative cartoon. Here's another negative cartoon. Again, they're all just Roosevelt appointees. These are all cartoons being done by anti-court packing plan cartoonists. And this one here, you see, he's already has the legislative branch in line. He already has the executive branch in line. He's trying to whip the judicial branch in line here. And this is where this cartoon makes sense. He's already reorganized government, and if he reorganizes the Supreme Court, then he'll actually rise to dictatorship, controlling all 3 branches. The plan fails. Eventually, the plan dies out. He takes back his Supreme Court packing plan. It was a sort of failure. He got a lot of negative support. He still changes the court, though, because remember, he wins 4 elections. And so he's in the White House for 13 years. And so he actually, I think, he appoints 7 judges within his 13 years. So he really does remake the court regardless. Okay, now on the tail end of this. Recession of 1937. By 1937, the economy was slowly getting better. I'll put that to the side in a second. So you see here, there's a great crash in 29. There's Hoover. Crashes down. Okay, right there, 32. The election of 32, Roosevelt wins election. By 33, Roosevelt takes power. Okay? Then he institutes his New Deal. So you see the economy rising through the New Deal. Getting better, right? And then 37, he says, wow, the economy has almost made a comeback to where it was. We are going to stop funding these government relief agencies. We're going to start not hiring people to work in these public works administration, these relief agencies. Okay? And once he does that, we're going to see people losing their jobs again and not be able to be rehired in industry. So we see immediate dip in our economy. Okay, so what he does, instead of having a great fall like Hoover did, he's going to immediately start putting money back into those agencies to hire people again, so we immediately go back up. And then in 1940, you see a crazy spike. If I was in class, I'd ask you, well, what happens in 1939? And eventually, by 41, what happens? Is World War II. We're going to see a crazy increase in our economy because of the war. So the economy was starting to do better, so many worried about inflation. So a lot of new agencies were cut, and immediately people were not able to find work. This is called the Roosevelt recession. Instead of making it a full depression, we immediately put money back into those agencies. And then, like I said, by 1938, the New Deal had ended. Actually, I should have said that 9. Because what we started to do is start plan for war. And so I love this cartoon here, is that the old reliable, when the economy is in recession, the old reliable is spending. Government spending. Spend money on infrastructure projects. By doing that, you're going to pump money into the economy, thus raising it. But how do you pay for this? You have this huge New Deal, all these government expenses. How do you pay for this, right? And how do you pay for all these kids you have to raise? Well, John Maynard Keynes basically came up with this idea called deficit spending. And this was the idea that Roosevelt was going to use. Spend money artificially, go make America into debt. By doing that, you'll raise the economy. By raising the economy, you'll actually create more tax revenue that comes in later on. So instead of taxing people to raise money for this, you're going to borrow money, make the government go to debt, and eventually get out of debt by a bigger economy, creating more tax revenue. These again, it's Keynesian economics. Okay, the legacy of the New Deal, the lasting effects of the New Deal. For African Americans, it is going to be a mixed bag. There are some good things that FDR does. There are some bad things that he does not do. So one thing, he does put people into charge that are advisors. Again, not official cabinet members, but people that are in secondary positions. So he does sort of flood the White House and flood some of his agencies with some African Americans to advise him. That's a good thing. Mary McLeod Bethune is one of those ladies. The bad thing he does is that a lot of his New Deal agencies do not hire blacks. And that is a problem. And it wasn't like Roosevelt was anti-African American or racist. The reason why he did that is that his thought is that by helping African Americans out, that he would lose support in those southern states. And he said, we need to get out of the Depression. And that's more important than anything else was the Depression. And he thought that if he gave African Americans too many rights or too many positions, that the southern states would not support him anymore, thus him out of office. So he should have done more for African Americans. That is one of his big-time criticisms that would be a true criticism. For women, he did put the first woman into a secondary position, Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor. He also is going to have his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, because of his disability, be extremely on the forefront of helping him out. Eleanor Roosevelt is going to be a big proponent. He's going to go around the country. He's going to be very outspoken. And that is going to, in turn, put the First Lady position and as an actual position that has an actual, can actually sway people or do things within that office of the First Lady. And so First Ladies after Roosevelt are going to be much more proactive and usually have an agenda to follow as well. Like, for example, Michelle Obama's agenda was to get American kids healthy, and she was very outspoken. Melania Trump doesn't really have a big office. Again, it was to in bullying on social media, but she didn't really use that office to really push an agenda as much as some other people. Native Americans, he sort of helped out by creating the Indian Reorganization Act. And what that did, it reversed the Dawes Act. He restored right of tribes to own land, to promote self-government and ban assimilation. So he really did help the Native Americans out by saying that, hey, you are different than America, you don't have to be assimilated, we are not going to control your tribal lands anymore. And he basically gives the tribal lands the ability to self-govern themselves. So if you go to a Native American reservation today, you will see that actually on that reservation, there's going to be Native American police and Native American judicial system. There's going to be Native American laws. Again, they still have to follow federal laws, but they are their own, almost their little mini countries within America. New Deal in the South. New Deal allows existing racism to happen, and again, they failed to challenge Jim Crow laws, and FDR did not pass any anti-lynching laws. So all these are sort of failures of the FDR administration. He doesn't add to them, or he doesn't promote this type of stuff, but he doesn't do anything to stop it. The West was extremely benefited because of this, because they increased huge amounts of funding, and a lot of the CCC work is going to be in the West, in those national parks. And the New Deal on the economy is going to be big. The New Deal did not end the Depression. World War II did, actually, but it's going to put all those systems in place that are still around today, like the Social Security, welfare state. There's going to be a lot of relief programs. And so starting now, government is going to be not laissez-faire anymore, and we're going to have a direct say in the economy going forward. We're going to have the direct regulation of banks and stock market and other things as well. And here's a great slide here. We see that, where's the one I like the best? The GDP. I like to start with this one. So you see in the 20s is going pretty good. This is the gross national product, how much we produce. 29 is going well. Then we fall in the Great Depression. And then we see Roosevelt's New Deal happen, goes up. And then the war eventually takes us crazy. Unemployment. You see very little unemployment in the 20s. Crazy unemployment by the time Roosevelt takes office. The New Deal ends unemployment, makes it better. This is the New Deal recession right here. And then the war ends unemployment. Business failures. A lot of business failures in the 20s and 30s, and then we see that it goes down. And I like this one too, the national debt, the federal debt. So you see federal debt here, very little federal debt because Hoover did nothing to really, so this was from the war, and then we're lower and lower and lower it. And then the New Deal with all the different agencies caused our federal debt to go up. And then the war itself, World War II, caused it to go up crazily. Okay, and another thing in politics, huge amounts of presidential power. So the power of the presidency completely went up during Roosevelt. Okay, here's a great cartoon. We see America, Uncle Sam's sick, right? And we see FDR coming in as the doctor, New Deal remedies. We see Congress as the maid basically doing everything Roosevelt wants. This shows that Congress was going to do basically everything Roosevelt wants. Congress is not a true check on Roosevelt's power. And look at what he's giving. He's giving the America all these different drugs, all these CWA and CCC and AAA and HOLC and the NRA. And he says, of course, we may have to change remedies. if we don't get results. Okay, that's a New Deal lecture. I know it's a long one. Have a great day, and we'll see you guys later.